So I just want to start by thanking Raj and Teresa for the invitation to join you all. And thank you all for joining us here today. This is a project I'm working on in collaboration with my colleague, who's a senior economist at U.S. Department of Agriculture, Ron Sands. And I'm here to talk to you today about the potential for economic and environmental impacts from reducing food waste, food loss, and changing food consumption. So a quick overview of what I'll talk to you about today. More specifically, we are going to use the European Union's Farm to Fork strategy as a case study. And so the Farm to Fork strategy is an ambitious set of policy proposals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions along the food and agricultural supply chain as a part of the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal ultimately has a goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And so the Farm to Fork strategy addresses agricultural production, food processing, food manufacturing, transportation of food, retailing of food, and food consumption. And so today I'll speak about why we did this research, what we did in terms of analysis, what we found. And a quick preview is that we find that there are various socioeconomic impacts to reducing food consumption and food waste. But 3 years after unveiling the Farm to Fork strategy, the European Union has actually passed no legislation to make the changes that they were hoping to see. So Ron and I work as agricultural economists, and so we study how the literal sausage is made and how much it costs. So this is what we do on a daily basis. But in this research project, we were looking to understand how the metaphorical sausage would be made under the Farm to Fork strategy if it were to be implemented. And so we ultimately find that in the case of the Farm to Fork strategy as it is now, little to no metaphorical sausage has actually been made. And so why did we do it? And so why did we do this particular research? And it has to do with the fact that the Farm to Fork strategy covers the full agricultural food supply chain in the European Union, including policy proposals on agricultural production. But today we're going to focus on consumer-related proposals out of the Farm to Fork strategy involving consumption and food waste, because there are opportunities for positive public health outcomes and environmental sustainability. Because those of us who live in high-income countries, like citizens of the European member states or those of us in the United States, ultimately we are eating too much, and this behavior is coming with very severe environmental consequences. So in regards to the opportunities for public health improvements, in 2016, it was found that over half of adults over the age of 18 across the globe had overweight or obesity. And so clinically, this means that you have a BMI over 25, indicating that you're overweight, or if you have a BMI over 30, this would indicate that you have obesity. So overweight and obesity are no longer isolated to high-income countries, and there are very real negative health and quality of life consequences to the food that we are currently consuming. So the World Health Organization stresses that overweight and obesity are preventable. So as we see with the European Union's Farm to Fork strategy, there are opportunities to create public policy that can prevent overweight and obesity. And so this is what the European Union is looking to do in its Farm to Fork strategy. There are also environmental consequences, but at the same time, opportunities for consumers to make environmental improvements by changing their dietary habits. So particularly when we think about food loss and food waste, as was mentioned previously in Dr. Leon's presentation. So food loss here, I'm going to talk to you about today. Food loss and food waste are actually very distinct phenomena, where food loss is the inadvertent loss of edible food along the supply chain in harvesting, processing, manufacturing of food. And so typically we would think about food loss as being somewhat accidental. And this is different than food waste, where food waste is retailers and consumers disposing of food that was once perfectly fit for human consumption. And so we would identify food waste as being somewhat purposeful. But for simplicity here today, I will refer to both from here on out as food waste, but just know we're talking about food loss, which is accidental, and food waste, which is generally purposeful. And so in terms of trends of food loss and food waste, we see that Asian countries rank the highest in terms of aggregate food waste. And this is essentially a numbers game, where India and China are producing food to feed nearly 3 billion people combined. And so they are producing massive amounts of food and as a result, generating massive amounts of food waste. But it's important to think about in Western countries like the United States, we are the highest ranking in terms of food waste per person per day. So all of us on this call today, all situated in the United States, we are at the pinnacle of wasting food every single day compared to other folks in different countries around the world. And so because of this waste, there's an inefficient use of resources. And studies have shown that this food waste is inefficient use of energy resources, particularly energy-intensive agricultural inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. So for example, in 2001, South Korea reported that nearly 60% of strawberry production in the country was lost in the transportation stage of the supply chain. And so you may think, oh, that's a very large quantity of strawberries to lose, but what does this really mean? So when we dig into the style of production that South Korea has, South Korea is very active in greenhouse production, which was mentioned in the previous session. And so greenhouse produced strawberries are going to be naturally more energy and water intensive because they require artificial lighting and continual irrigation. And so South Korea really losing 60% of strawberry production, knowing that the bulk of that strawberry production is under greenhouse, is a very inefficient use of those energy intensive resources. Last week, excuse me. And so in this global context, where the European Union is really trying to make some of these big changes to avoid this massive amount of food loss, but while ultimately changing consumer behavior, I just wanted to show you guys a short video that is summarizing the Farm to Fork Strategy's efforts.
The European Commission published its long-awaited Farm to Fork strategy. At the heart of the Green Deal, the strategy marks a paradigm shift, moving the focus from food production and agriculture to food systems. And the objective is very clear. The EU will make sustainability a key pillar of its food policy and will set global standards for sustainable food supply chain. The Farm to Fork strategy lists 27 actions covering food production, processing, retailing, and waste, and is articulated around 4 main elements. First, it puts the consumer at the center and underlines the role of consumer demand in driving change. From a proposal for front-of-pack nutrition labeling to the creation of a sustainable labeling framework that covers nutrition, climate, environmental, and social aspects of food products, the proposed actions from the Commission aim to enable consumers to make health and sustainability conscious choices. Second, regarding food production, the new Common Agricultural Policy will be a crucial tool to enable a more sustainable agriculture. The Commission sets multiple targets, for example, reduction of the use of chemical pesticides, reduction of the use of fertilizers, and also announced the revision of several pieces of legislation, including on pesticides, feed additives, and animal welfare. Thirdly, the strategy looks at industry behavior and seeks concrete commitments from food companies on health and sustainability. The European Commission will develop a EU Code of Conduct for responsible business and marketing practices and will require food companies to integrate sustainability into corporate strategies. Finally, the Farm to Fork strategy recognizes the impossibility for the EU to succeed alone. EU trade policy should seek to obtain concrete commitments from third countries on the use of pesticides, animal welfare, and the fight against antimicrobial resistance. This also raises the question of shorter supply chains, and a fine balance will have to be found to ensure increased resilience of EU food systems without turning to protectionism. The Farm to Fork strategy comes at a time where the agri-food sector has been severely impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, which put Europe's food security to the test and is threatening the livelihood of many farmers. Most actions under the strategy are not expected before 2022, giving the EU time to transform its food system while leaving the one behind.
Great. So knowing that there are opportunities for public health and environmental improvements, the European Union has ultimately developed this farm to fork strategy as a part of the European Green Deal's efforts to transition away from fossil fuels and have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So that's where the farm to fork strategy is really situated in broader EU environmental policy. And so when we're talking about zero emissions here, we mean when all the emissions released by human activity are offset by activities that remove carbon from the atmosphere, like replanting forests, reducing fertilizer and pesticide use. So all of those things are involved in the European Union getting to net zero emissions. And so the EU decided that this wasn't necessarily ambitious enough. So in 2021, they legislated reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, which is really around the corner. And this is from 1990 levels. And you may have heard of this. It's referred to as Fit for 55. And so given that the farm to fork strategy is a part of this broader effort, a very ambitious effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, it includes a variety of policy proposals that were mentioned in the video. And again, some of the proposals are related to agricultural production and food manufacturing, like we heard. But today I'm going to focus on the policies of the farm to fork strategy that are related to consumer behavior. So first, we have nutrient profiles, which was policy that would penalize food manufacturers from making claims about the healthfulness of a product when it was actually also high in fats, oils, or sugars. So an example of this, if we were thinking about a brand of cereal that maybe was high in fiber, but also high in sugar. So in the past, the cereal would be labeled as healthy because it was high in fiber, but under this policy proposal, that would be no longer because it was also high in sugar and really not conveying the amount of healthfulness the European Union would want. And ultimately, we see that this policy proposal was actually tabled. So the European Union will no longer consider this policy as a part of the farm to fork strategy. And this happened because there were concerns from Mediterranean member states that felt their traditional foods like olive oils and cheeses would be penalized under this nutritional profile policy. And so ultimately, it will not go through as a part of the farm to fork strategy. There's additional food fraud policies that would ensure food is what it says it is, particularly when the European Union is considering foreign imports. There's nutrition labeling policy that would put labels on the front of packaging. So when we all see all of that nutrition labeling on the back of the package, that would be moved to the front of the package. There would be additional country of origin labeling beyond what the European Union already has. There would be new mandatory minimums for institutional procurement of sustainable foods. There was significant conversation about food date marking policies that would reduce food waste by helping consumers understand the shelf life of food products. And so this is, when we all open the fridge and we open the jar of something and we take a whiff and we're not sure whether or not it's good to eat still. So they would come up with food date marking that would really help consumers understand if they should throw something away or not. And there would be additional food waste targets beyond the food waste targets that currently exist for EU member states. And so since 2020, we see here on the left of our table that none of these policies have actually been passed to be legislation. So when we think about the farm to fork strategy, the policy proposals that it's made, none of these policy proposals have come to fruition yet. And so what are we doing to analyze the issue? So as the European Union sorts out the policy rules and regulations to reduce food consumption, food loss, and food waste, we still want to know what are the socioeconomic consequences of these forthcoming efforts if they are to happen. And so the methods that we use in our analysis are the future agricultural resource model. And so this is a computable general equilibrium model, and it is heavily based on economic theory. And so there are three particular kind of pieces of theory that the model abides by. First, that producers supply of goods and services equals consumers' demand for those same goods and services. And essentially, this is just supply equals demand. Another piece of theory out of the model is that producers are going to sell goods and services for the same amount it costs to make those goods and services. And we refer to this as the zero profit condition. And the third piece of theory is that consumers are going to expend their entire income every period. But this can also include, spending on savings. So consumers are allowed to save, but it all has to go somewhere. So all of the dollars that people are making from their salary have to be allocated. And the data that we use in our model is the GTAP data. So the Global Trade Analysis Project has a database that represents the global economy. It includes data on production, consumption, intermediate use of goods and services all across the economy. And it also includes data on bilateral trade flows. But we supplement this data set with the Food and Agricultural Organization's food balance data on the availability of food calories for most countries in the world. And this data set includes information on food production, food imports, and food exports in greater detail. And so here we are looking at a figure that's going to help us understand the FAO food balance data a bit better. And so we're looking at for select regions of the world, and we're looking at the time period of 2010 compared to 2021. And specifically, we want to know the calories available per person per day in those regions. And so we see the composition of these calories on the right-hand side, where in pink we have animal products or meat. In yellow, we have cereals, we have seafood, fruit, starches, sugars, oils, and vegetables. So we can see for these reasons, what is the composition for the calories that are made available to those residents. And so out of all of this, the World Health Organization recommends for everybody on the globe to have about 2,000 calories per adult per day. And so we see by 2021, China is on par with Europe in terms of producing about 3,000 daily per capita calories. And further down our figure, we see God bless America. In the United States, we are producing around 3,500 calories for every man, woman, and child every single day in this country. So that's 1,500 calories more than the World Health Organization is recommending that we consume. And this is in contrast to countries like India, Japan, and Nigeria, and South Africa that are producing around 2,000 or 2,500 calories. And so this is particularly interesting because Japan's available calories are on par with less developed economies, but still the amount of calories the World Health Organization would recommend that they consume. And one concerning point here is we see the decline in available calories in Nigeria between 2010 and 2021, particularly in animal products. So later in the presentation, when we talk more about the recommended style of diet that we should be consuming, this is important for us to know that Nigeria needs certain protein for sustainable active lifestyle. And we do see this reduction here. So we have to be mindful of that. So in our model, we're actually going to model 3 diet scenarios. So we're going to take our model, input this data so we can test these 3 scenarios. So the first scenario is the static diet, as we'll call it. And this is just everybody around the globe maintaining their 2011 diet. So to say everyone just proceeds business as usual with the 2011 diet. Our second scenario is an income-driven diet that is going to show increases in consumption as income grows. And then our third diet scenario is a 50% Eat Lancet diet. So in 2019, the Eat Lancet research team developed a set of recommendations for everybody on the globe to have a plant-based diet that ultimately limited the amount of animal protein, refined grains, and added sugar. So if we think about, all of us who do this style of research, everybody would say the Eat Lancet diet is a diet that is recommended both for human health and environmental health. And so this perhaps could be the goal that all countries are looking to achieve. And so in this particular scenario, we model it as a global scenario, not only for Europe, because as mentioned in the video, Europe is going to need its partner countries to also follow this pattern of consumption. But it's important to know that in the Eat Lancet diet for low-income countries with prevalent malnutrition, this might mean these countries increasing the consumption of animal protein and refined grains to actually achieve a healthy diet for themselves. And so ultimately, we're going to assume that these population, underlying population in our model is following the medium United Nations projections for population increase. And so what do we find? So here we'll discuss the impact of changing global diets on agricultural production, food waste, land use, and imports to the European Union. And so in this first figure, we're looking at the results on global diets and food waste. And so on the topic of available calories for each of the three scenarios, in the green set of lines are calories from primary agricultural production or crop calories. And the orange set of lines are calories available for food consumption, or what we'll call food calories. So crop calories in green, food calories in orange. And so when we dig into the crop calories in green, we find that the income-driven diet will naturally increase agricultural production and agricultural crop calories. And so ultimately, the notorious BIG was right, more money, more problems, but here we see specifically more money, more food, more health and environmental problems, unfortunately, with that income-driven diet. The static diet shows a modest increase in crop calories over time, so us just doing 2011 business as usual. But in the olive color, so this trying to achieve 50% of the Eat Lancet diet, this helps us lower the trajectory of all of the agricultural calories produced in the world. And so how do we measure food waste in this scenario? So as Dr. Leon mentioned in his presentation, food waste is the difference between our green crop calories and our orange food calories. So the amount of food we produce compared to the amount of food that's available for us to actually eat. And so the gap between the green lines and the orange lines, again, is food waste. So accidental losses across the supply chain before it gets to retailers and consumers, and then food loss, which is purposeful food waste from retail sales and household consumption. And so getting the green lines closer to the orange lines means a reduction in food waste, which is very difficult to achieve. But when we look at our food calories in orange, it's important to note that the static diet and the 50% Eat Lancet diet actually overlap. And you might be curious in noticing that there's a difference actually between the green lines for crop calories from our static scenario and crop calories in our Eat Lancet scenario compared to not having a difference in the static food calorie and the Eat Lancet food calories in orange. And this is because the more healthful diet actually has greater food losses because grains have higher rates of food loss than meat and animal products. And so this essentially means, we can all hear our grandmothers in the background telling us, don't waste that meat. So ultimately, meat gets wasted less than grains. And as we alter our diet to consume more fresh fruit and vegetable, consume less animal products, perhaps in some countries, consume more healthful, diverse grains, this actually is causing more food waste and perhaps not getting us to the goal of reduction in food waste in some scenarios. And so next, we look at global land use. And so in regards to land use and the environmental impact of consumers' behavior, for each of the three diet scenarios, we have another set of lines in blue, and this is all crop areas in million hectares. And so here, given we grow crops for other purposes outside of food, as was mentioned previously, including feed for livestock production, fiber such as cotton, hemp, or flax for the clothes we wear, fuel for the cars we drive like corn for ethanol, and flowers and ornamentals like Christmas trees. All of this is included in all of the acres that are used for agricultural production across the world. At the same time, we have a red set of lines, which are food crop areas, and this is the million hectares of land that are required to produce the food that we consume. And so ultimately, given population growth, the land that we will use will continue to rise, really regardless of whatever consumption scenario we have. So land use is not changing as drastically, even with trying to achieve, what is the Eat Lancet recommended diet. And lastly, when we think about the economics of the situation, we can look to imports to Europe. And so as Europe hopes to radically change its diet and therefore agricultural production patterns of all of its trading partners across the world, we find that there are actually drastic changes to European imports from it trying to achieve the 50% Eat Lancet scenario. So here we're going to look at 3 commodities: wheat, fruit and veg, and ruminants, which is essentially red meat. So when we look at the wheat scenario, we can see that the static and the income-driven diet have, similar pattern of wheat imports to the European Union. But we find that reducing European consumption of grains will require a drastic decline in wheat imports in the Eat Lancet diet scenario. And we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for countries like Ukraine that are critical grain exporters and currently struggling with geopolitical turmoil when Europe is going to reduce its wheat imports? And also, what does this mean for countries like Madagascar and Dr. Osterhout's presentation? Countries like Madagascar, etc., that are producing complementary goods like vanilla that go into these delicious European pastries that European consumers are asking to reduce their consumption of. Next, when we look at fruit and veg, we see a drastic increase in fruit and vegetable imports to Europe based on the Eat Lancet diet scenario. So this is saying Europe cannot produce all of the fruit and vegetable that the Eat Lancet scenario recommends, and so they will have to have drastic increases in fruit and vegetable imports. And then lastly, following the same trend as wheat, there's a drastic decline in imports of red meat in the Eat Lancet scenario. So Europeans are asked to reduce their red meat consumption, and we see this will ultimately impact imports. And we have to think about all the countries that are exporting red meat products to the European Union and what will be the cascading impact to those regions and countries of the world. So lastly, I just want to close with societal implications. And so, Ron and I feel here that we've shown, even with a moderate transition to the Eat Lancet recommended diet scenario, this can lead to drastic interrelated changes in the socioeconomics of the food system. So some surprising things showed up. But we also show that there's consistently higher level of agricultural production that's required to produce food calories given historical food waste. And we've seen this, in Dr. Leon's presentation and other studies. So this is perhaps nothing new. But at the same time, the European Union has developed a very ambitious set of proposals that was thoughtful about the interconnectedness of the food system, changing diets and reducing waste. But nearly 3 years after presenting the Farm to Fork strategy, the European Union has not delivered on the legislation that will fully support the transformational change in the behavior of its consumers. And so there is more left to be studied. And so I just want to thank you all for having me here today. At the end of my slides, I do have multimedia resources available for faculty, and I do recommend the last resource. So the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI, has a great webinar here. And I just also wanted to give a plug to Jacksonville State students who are on the call today. You've heard from Dr. Leon, Dr. Osterhout, and myself today. I would say definitely consider graduate school at Indiana University if any of these topics were of interest to you. And like Sarah, I was a Peace Corps volunteer myself, so I highly recommend Peace Corps service as well. So thank you all very much.